Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're looking at imperialism again. This is the second session in our mini-series, which is going to run for 5 or 6 sessions. So we're looking at different aspects. Bear with us. We've both got a cold today, Ian and myself, but we're doing our best. So over to Ian. Thank you for preparing this for us tonight, Ian.
Good evening, comrades. It's been a fascinating journey preparing this one because whilst many on the left will have read Lenin, Higher Stage of Capitalism, not many people will have read that of Nikolai Bukharin or some of Rosa Luxemburg's work on imperialism. Whilst there are obvious similarities between Bukharin and Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg's approach was really quite different and written somewhat earlier. The main purpose of this really is to draw out what some of the debates were and how it affects the way in which imperialism is discussed today. Whether, for example, we can talk about imperialism as being a stage in the development of capitalism, or whether we need to think in terms of imperialism as always having been a feature of capitalism. And what do we mean by it in terms of the way in which the surplus is extracted from the population of another country, for example? The slide is the picture on this slide is the devilfish in Egyptian waters, which is from a US satirical cartoon about the tentacles of British imperialism stretching, as we see, from Boer's land, South Africa, through to India, through to Egypt, and so on. So let's have a little look for a moment at Nikolai Bukharin, Nikolai Ivanovich Bukharin. Those are his dates, 1888 to 1938. When we look at Bukharin and we look at Luxemburg, what we're up against really is quite often a critique of them from different perspectives, which kind of precedes whatever they've written. So, you know, what everybody knows about Bukharin, of course, is that he sided with Stalin against Trotsky. And from that point of view, tends to render almost anything he ever wrote on the subject of imperialism as kind of somehow out of order, as it were. Bukharin had a kind of long and illustrious history as a Russian revolutionary. He joined the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party in 1906. And he was regarded by Lenin as a significant theorist of the Bolshevik faction of the RSDLP. He, for example, had a hand in Stalin's writing of the only thing that Stalin was ever regarded as being a kind of expert in, which was the national question. And Bukharin had a hand in that. The other thing about Bukharin, of course, is that he was actually the originator of the notion of socialism in one country, although it's usually credited with Stalin for good reason. Bukharin, in fact, was the first person to sort of try to theorize the position that the Soviet Union found itself in and looked at the question of whether Russia could, in fact, build socialism in one country with the ultimate aim of exporting it around the world. The other point about it, of course, is that whilst he's regarded as having somehow been on the right of the Bolsheviks, because of his association with Stalin, he was at one point on the left. He was, for example, an advocate of war communism, but later supported the new economic policy. So he was no slouch intellectually. He studied economics at what was then the Moscow Imperial University. He was the editor of Pravda. And from 1926 to 1929, he was General Secretary of the Comintern's Executive Committee. And of course, what everybody else knows about him is, of course, at various times he sided with Zinoviev and Kamenev, but ultimately he was purged in 1937 and shot in 1938 for treason. So that tends to cloud, I think, a lot of the discussion around a lot of the understanding of Bukharin. I mean, to a certain extent, people just simply don't read him. But this is probably his best known work. There are other essays and things that he's written and are available on the Marx Engels Internet Archive. Imperialism and World Economy. As I said in the last meeting on imperialism, whereas Lenin had written Imperialism, the Higher Stage of Capitalism, as a popular work for a wide audience, but had a specific polemical aim in mind, aimed against the Karl Kautsky in particular, but also in the context of the First World War and the collapse of the Second International. Bukharin had actually written his work earlier. It was written in 1915, and it had to be smuggled into the Russian Empire because he was writing under conditions of illegality, whereas Lenin had consciously written his work as a legal publication. So his work, Imperialism and World Economy, was smuggled into Russia and promptly seized, and sort of languished until 1917, when it was finally published. As you'll see on the front page of my copy, which is this green edition here, it has an introduction by Lenin, which, so in a sense, Lenin's seal of approval. The introduction wasn't actually published in 1917. It wasn't published until 1927 in Pravda. To a certain extent, Imperialism and World Economy by Bukharin is a polemic against Kautsky too, particularly in the closing chapters. But the main part of it is actually a far fuller discussion of imperialism compared to that of Lenin. Whereas Lenin's aim was purely polemical and written for that particular purpose at the time, this was really a rather kind of general overview of imperialism and the world economy written by Bukharin. Another thing that's often remarked upon is that Lenin famously said of Nikolai Bukharin, the trouble with Nicky is he doesn't understand dialectics. And that tends to kind of also cloud what people think about Bukharin's writings. Although actually, of course, in Imperialism and World Economy, he makes use of dialectics as a way of understanding the movements in the development of capitalism on a worldwide basis. So the important thing here is that it goes through a whole series of discussions around the development of capitalism on a world basis, and as a world economy. And this is the important thing. One of the features that is, when we talk about communism or the possibility of socialism, is that it would have to be a world society. It couldn't be in one country, because it would be rapidly crushed. And unless the countries in question that were the first, as it were suitably powerful enough to defend themselves. But here we are. Bukharin is talking about a world economy, and on the basis of that, certain things follow. So, for example, the tendency of profit to equalize from one country to another. So there is this constant quest, therefore, for investment in other areas where one can maximize profit, in common with Lenin's exposition. And there's a question mark about whether, given that this was written before Lenin wrote his work, the extent to which Bukharin was influential upon Lenin's thought. So Bukharin talks in terms of the development of trusts and cartels, monopoly, just in the same way that Lenin did. But above all, about the impact of imperialism as an internationalization of capitalism, the movement of capitalism into every far-flung corner of the globe. But not that means that there aren't important differences, for example, between national economies and the banks. And in common again with Lenin and indeed Rudolf Hilferding, talks of finance capital. Finance capital in in this case, as with Lenin and Hilferding, is this combination of the bank, capital, and industry. So, for example, major banks lending money to, for example, major industrialists who in turn effectively end up owning banks. The other aspect of it, of course, is that Bukharin was quite clear on the importance of imperialism to extract a higher rate of profit, if you like, a super exploitation as a consequence of imperialism, partly because of the ability to exploit workers for lower rates of pay, but also importantly, for if you recall when we discussed the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, one of the kind of mitigating factors against the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which arises as a result of a higher organic composition of capital, and to cut out all the jargon, that means that as it's only human labor that creates new value, the fact that more and more machinery is incorporated in the developed world means that one way in which you can maintain profits is to have the super exploitation of people in areas which have a kind of a colonial or semi-colonial status. Now, the point about it, of course, is that as Bukharin brings out, there is, as it were, a world market for raw materials, and therefore an imperialist quest to seize parts of the globe from which they can extract those raw materials. And again, we're not really seeing a great deal of difference with Lenin. What you do get with Bukharin is an extremely readable exposition of the importance of imperialism in the world economy, again, against the background of the First World War. Couldn't resist this enlistment poster. The empire needs men, helped by young lions. So these are the dominions, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand in particular, and also India, which of course provided 1 million soldiers during the First World War. Helped by the young lion, the old lion defies his foe. Imperialism, of course, then is inextricably bound up with militarism. If you were looking for a difference between Bukharin and Lenin, one could argue that whereas Lenin tended to focus upon the importance of imperialism as enriching, as it were, the aristocracy of labor, the skilled section of the working class, and effectively buying off their support for the imperialist project. Always has to be remembered that in the First World War, conscription didn't have to be introduced until 1916 and was never introduced in Ireland at all. And of course, many thousands of Irishmen joined up and of course perished. Bukharin, of course, also talks in terms of imperialism as about being concerned with the concentration of capital. And it also brings us into another factor involved in the need for expansion into other parts of the world. The tendency of imperialist countries for overproduction. And if you, in a position where, for example, you're producing too much steel, and you effectively end up with a glut on the market, how convenient is it, therefore, if you happen to also to be concerned with building a railroad from Cairo to the Cape, or in the case of Germany, helping to build railways in Ottoman Turkey. But of course, what you see with Bukharin, in common with Lenin, is imperialist policies arise only on a certain level of historic development. And from that point of view, the implication is that it's really imperialism which reaches its kind of highest stage, as Lenin argued. And that also implies, of course, that with the end of the imperialist phase, or with the imperialist phase, one is approaching the end, the potential end of capitalism itself. From the point of view of any kind of difference with Lenin, instead of it being a question of the aristocracy of labor being affected by by capitalism, effectively becoming a privileged section of the working class of the proletariat in the imperialist countries. Instead, rather, Bukharin tends to see it as affecting the whole proletariat. The whole proletariat is affected by its privileged status in the context of an imperialist empire. The other thing that's interesting in Bukharin's work is his discussion of state capitalism and state socialism. State capitalism, of course, is one of those terms that's been kind of bandied about, typically in the context of the characterization of the Soviet Union. For example, the Socialist Workers' Party famously regarded the Soviet Union as state capitalist. And from that point of view, the term has become associated with that. But Bukharin and Lenin were using the concepts of state capitalism in a rather different way, that you could have a situation where trusts and cartels became so integrated with the state that you effectively ended up with the state direction of capitalism, and never more so as during wartime. And we've seen historically the British state, for example, and Germany in much the same way, directed industrial production during the period of the First World War. Others, of course, that Bukharin is addressing as a polemic we're talking about state socialism from that point of view, the idea that you could have the state bringing socialism into being. Bukharin was resolutely a revolutionary communist, and took the opportunity to dismiss the idea that you could have state socialism, something he associates with a sort of petty bourgeois stratum, particularly in the German economy, who are associated with being professors at universities and that kind of thing. But the importance here of state capitalism is, of course, that at crucial times, actually, the state does become involved in directing capitalist enterprise. And we see that even today, whether it's in terms of development of a vaccine for COVID, or having a hand in research and development, which would otherwise not necessarily be taken on by capitalist enterprises directly. So Bukharin then was following in similar lines to that of Lenin, and tended to see it in terms of being a higher stage of development. Really quite different then to how Rosa Luxemburg sees the concept of imperialism. I should just add, I've got a copy of The Accumulation of Capital, from which I've taken, which I've used to prepare this. The Accumulation of Capital is itself an interesting book, and I'll come on to that more in a moment. But I'm just to say that I'm using the Routledge edition, if anybody wants to follow it up. Anyway, for those who are unfamiliar with Rosa Luxemburg, she was born as Rosalia Luxemburg in a secular Jewish family in Poland. Was a member of the social democracy of the Kingdom of Poland and Lithuania, and from that point of view was very much, as it were, on the left wing of Second International social democracy. She was, and many of her works, of course, are a polemical attack on people like Edward Bernstein, where she attacks his revisionism of Marxism, and his tendency to therefore use reformist politics, and the idea that, as it were, the movement is everything, and the end, the revolution, is in a sense nothing. Again, intellectually no slouch. She gained her doctorate from University of Zurich on economics, and The Accumulation of Capital is her only real published work on economics. She became a German citizen in 1897 and a member of the SPD in 1898, and was, of course, co-founder with Karl Liebknecht of the Spartakusbund. And it was, of course, that very SPD leadership that was complicit in her murder and that of Liebknecht in 1919. All of that you'll be very familiar with. I think the other thing to say about this is not only was she part of, if you like, the the mainstream revolutionary Marxist orthodoxy of Second International social democracy. And she tends to be associated with, as it were, the left somewhat later. And partly because of her critique of some of the organizational ideas of Lenin's, tends to be quite appealing to people of a more kind of libertarian background on the left, on the far left in particular. And so once again, like Bukharin, ideas around her notions on the national question or imperialism tend to be rather coloured by a tendency to see her as a kind of anti-Bolshevik communist and somehow different. The point I'm making here is that, like Lenin, she was very much part of that orthodox Marxism of the Second International, and of course it was the betrayal of that Second International by Kautsky and others that led her into the position of forming the Spartacus Bund. So then the accumulation of capital. The accumulation of capital, if you're going to read it, I would suggest you start with section 3, which is the bit that refers largely to imperialism. That's not to say that the other 2/3 of the book, or in fact 3/4 of the book, aren't worth reading. They are, but they take place in a particular context. The accumulation of capital was written by Luxemburg as really as a critique of Marx. And if that makes her sound revisionist or something, well, far from it. She was using Marx's method to address central questions that were raised particularly by Volume 2 of Capital. If anybody gets the opportunity to have a go with Volume 2 of Capital, be my guest. It's Hours of Innocent Merriment. The interesting thing about Volume 2 of Capital, of course, is it was not written for publication. It was prepared by Engels after Marx's death. But what it's concerned with really is the circulation of capital, and above all, its realization. The idea of it, if you're in a position where you are making stuff to sell it, you need somebody to buy it. And what a lot of the book is concerned with, Volume 2 of Capital, I mean, is the difference between, as it were, the section of the economy which is concerned with producer goods, producing machine tools and things like that, means of production, and as it were, consumer goods, and the importance of the balance between them. And although many people have criticized Luxemburg's understanding of Volume 2 of Capital, what she was doing really was trying to answer what she saw as some of the contradictions in Volume 2. So if you're going to read The Accumulation of Capital, I would start with section 3 and then start at the beginning, preferably having read Volume 2 of Capital. Anyway, Luxemburg's Accumulation of Capital was written in 1913 and was familiar to both Bukharin and Lenin, and both of them were very critical of it. They were critical of it on a number of counts. Bukharin, in a 1924 essay criticizing Luxemburg's The Accumulation of Capital, argued that because she failed to understand Marx's description of the accumulation of capital in Volume 2 of Capital, that consequently this led her to erroneous conclusions with regard to imperialism. However, what I'm going to argue is that, notwithstanding that, that you can gain very, very valuable insights by reading Luxemburg on imperialism. One of the important points that she makes is that capitalism arises and develops historically amidst non-capitalist society. We tend to think today of only really capitalism existing. After all, the whole world now is capitalist. We now know, the overwhelming majority of the world's population are in fact proletarians. This could not be said in 1913. Remember, it wasn't until the 1860s the whole of the Russian Empire, 1/5 of the land surface of the world, was serfdom abolished. So Luxemburg is writing at a time when large parts of the world, the majority of the world, in fact, was not capitalist. And what she's arguing, in fact, is that capitalism actually requires these non-capitalist parts of the world in order to realize the value being created in the capitalist parts of the world. Moreover, she's arguing quite rightly, in my opinion, that capitalism as a world system from its inception, even though we're often talking in terms of mercantile capital rather than industrial capital. And therefore, Luxemburg is arguing that really capitalism needs imperialism in order to realize its surplus value. And it does that in a number of ways. And one of the things that makes that third part of the accumulation of capital so readable is that she gives concrete examples, case studies, as it were, of the growth of imperialism and therefore capitalism in a range of different countries. And I'll mention some of those. The horrifying picture you see before you is of people who were mutilated in the Belgian Congo. The Belgian Congo was an interesting form of the extraction of a surplus from the working population. Between 1885 and 1908, the Belgian Congo was not a colony even of Belgium, but the personal property of King Leopold II of the Belgians. And unusually for the extraction of a surplus, it went something like this. Go into the forest, collect this amount of rubber, and if you don't bring back enough, I'll cut the hands of your children off. And that's precisely what happened. It's estimated that around 13 million people in Congo died during the period of King Leopold's control of the territory. A particularly extreme form of colonialism, but nevertheless, others have been no less brutal. So the important thing from Luxemburg's point of view is to gain important sources of productive forces such as land or, in this case, rubber. And so, we don't have capitalist relations of production in producing latex for the industrial manufacture of rubber. We have the direct, violent expropriation of a part of the surplus of the Congo in order to produce rubber. And it's to bring labor power into the service of capital. So areas, for example, where there was a relative abundance of land, sometimes the only way in which labor power could be brought to the service of capital was the imposition of money taxes. And so therefore, without actually going to work for money rather than growing your own stuff and making your own clothes, you had no choice but to put yourself at the service of capitalism. And it's to introduce, therefore, a commodity economy and to have this separation of trade and agriculture. One can argue that before you have the Industrial Revolution in Britain, one of the first things that was important was to have an agricultural revolution that preceded it. We don't really see crop rotation anymore. Things have moved on even further. But crop rotation was a radical solution at the time to massively increase agricultural yields, and on the basis of that, it was possible to have an industrial revolution. So from this point of view, Luxemburg sees imperialism not as a higher stages, although she does talk in terms of there being phases in the development of imperialism. So it's not that she rejects any kind of idea of a higher stage. You do see a notion of there are different levels of the development, and some of them we'll discuss now. The picture, by the way, is from the Punch magazine of 1876, in which Benjamin Disraeli is Aladdin, cast as Aladdin, selling new crowns for old, as in Aladdin selling new lamps for old, and of course a healthy or a despicable dose of anti-Semitism thrown in with Disraeli, who was of course of Sephardic Jewish heritage, being cast as a sort of huckster, selling the crown of India in exchange for the crown of Britain. So in Luxemburg, she talks in terms of the struggle against the natural economy, an introduction of the commodity economy and the struggle against the peasant economy, and gave a whole range of different examples. And these are the ones that are very kind of readable in the context of the accumulation of capital. In the context of the USA, for example, we see the expansion westwards of the displacement and indeed genocide of the Native American population, and the rounding up and putting into reservations. So the ethnic cleansing of the Native American population in order to turn the prairie into farmland. But even that was not enough, in a sense, because people were used to making their own clothes, producing their own things. But she talks in terms of the way in which industrialization in the East led to the export of finished industrial goods, and effectively ending up with farmers in the West of the United States ultimately being in debt for commodities which they had to buy rather than just simply make themselves. And this process against a peasant economy is one of the features of imperialism. Famously, of course, Britain, perfidious Albion, and its approach to China in the Opium Wars, forcing China to, despite the fact that, of course, opium could be grown in China, forcing China to accept imported opium with catastrophic consequences for the population of China. And opium was just one commodity of a number which China was forced to accept. So what Luxemburg is discussing is the way in which capitalism and imperialism are inextricably bound up, and are concerned with the destruction of pre-existing forms of economic organization. India being a classic case in point, as she points out, that there had been long-standing communal forms of land husbandry in the context of India, but this effectively was destroyed by, I mean, for example, the Mughal Empire pretty much left Indian villages to manage themselves. There was no great interference in the context of the Mughal Empire. There was an extraction of a surplus. There was the extraction of tribute, and we've mentioned this in last week, that in imperialism before capitalism included often, for example, the extraction of tribute, whether that was in the form of forced labor or whether that was in the form of corvée, that is to say, you hand over a part of your produce. But nevertheless, generally speaking, the largely communal farming of India was not interfered with by the Mughal Empire, but the British Empire ensured that a number of things happened. Firstly, clothes which had previously been made by Indian peasants were undercut by imported cotton goods from England. And similarly, communal forms of agricultural production were undermined by the need to produce for the market. So whereas Indian farmers would have been largely subsistence farmers, but sold a proportion of the surplus, instead now they had to sell for the market and then be subject to the kind of fluctuations of trade and prices dictated by others. So completely transforming that. So it's that struggle against the natural economy of India, bringing it into a colonial status, and similar happening in France and with Algeria. Interestingly, as well, of course, in the context of building Germany building railways in Turkey, one of the features that you see is not only do we get the export of large amounts of commodities from Germany, steel, to build railways, for example, but also then troops can be deployed to protect the production, the construction of the railway, and beyond that, what you also then get is Turkey in debt to Germany for building the railway. And this was another feature of colonialism. Now, whilst people have been critical of Luxembourg, and many of the criticisms are completely relevant, there starts to see, as you read through it, you can see how much of its contemporary relevance remains. The idea, for example, of in Egypt, for example, all of a sudden production of cotton on a large scale to meet the great cotton famine in Britain during the American Civil War. And one of the features of that, for example, then is the need to build dams in order to have irrigation for cotton fields and all the rest of it. And then, of course, Egypt being in debt to British banks. And so you see this interrelationship between extracting a surplus, not through just simply the forced expropriation, as in the case of King Leopold and rubber, but through the banking system. So loans to build dams then become a means of extracting a surplus from Egypt. In the context of Turkey and the Levant, Luxembourg is talking in terms of the way in which Turkish rule in the Ottoman Empire of Palestine, for example, completely disrupted the social relations in that context, but not so much as what happened subsequently. The interesting thing about Luxembourg's account, of course, it ends in 1913, but this is very much a feature of what happened in Palestine under British rule. The best account of it is given by Nathan Weinstock in his book Zionism, False Messiah, in which he gives an account of the Fellahin, the peasantry of not only Palestine but also of Egypt. And the Fellahin were virtually, although they were notionally tenant and therefore peasants, they were operating under conditions of debt bondage. And this relationship between the Fellahin and the Effendi, the ruling, the agricultural ruling class of the Levant, was one of the things that was disrupted, for example, by the imposition of the British Mandate and the settlement in the Levant, in Palestine, by large numbers of Jewish immigrants who were operating under conditions of commodity production. And that's just the point. It was commodity production for the market, disrupting and turning the Fellahin, who had been tied to the land, into landless proletarians. And not only that, landless proletarians who were prevented from even having a job. So Luxembourg's account then, although it has been subjected to criticisms, I think still has quite a lot that's worth taking into account. As she says, the imperialist phase of capitalist accumulation, which implies universal competition, comprises the industrialization and capitalist emancipation of the hinterland, where capital formerly realized its surplus value. And of course, although she doesn't talk in terms of finance capital in the way that Hilferding and Lenin and Bukharin do, she does make important points about international loans. And one can see even today how a surplus is extracted, for example, from third world countries on the basis of loans, often advanced, for example, for infrastructure projects and so on, and then accruing to Western banks. She discusses protective tariffs and accumulation and the part that they play in securing a hegemonic position for the imperialist countries. And of course, militarism. Now, here's another interesting aspect. Although you could argue that Luxembourg was wrong in a number of areas, her understanding of the importance of militarism, not merely as a form of force, which is a necessary part of the imperialist project, but as also an important part of the economic part of the imperialist project. So, and although she hadn't fully worked it out in the accumulation of capital, it's something that people took up later on in terms of what is the role played by militarism in terms of helping to generate an economic surplus. We see today in the United States, naturally the arms sector is doing very, very well, thank you very much. And one argument is that it helps to restore the balance, as it were, between productive sections of the economy, Department One, as it were, and the consumer goods section of the economy, Part Two. And these are the two parts that are often featured in Volume 2 of Capital. And what's the role, therefore, played by militarism and arms production, and above all, war, which actually produces the kind of massive destruction of value, which helps to maintain an equilibrium within the context of capitalism. The other aspect of imperialism, and I'll leave with this, is capitalism and catastrophe. The idea, if you follow the logic of Luxemburg's argument, is that once every corner of the world becomes completely capitalist, does this mean that we've reached the point at which capitalism will end? I leave that as a question mark, because after all, we're not seeing any signs imminently of the demise of capitalism. And it looks as if we're moving ever more towards barbarism. But nevertheless, it posed that interesting question about how capitalism comes to an end now that the majority of the world's population are the proletariat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Excellent introduction. Very enjoyable to learn more about Bukharin and Luxemburg. Comrades, if you have any questions or comments, please can you click raise hand, and then we'll bring you in. So perhaps could you sum up for us then the key difference and why Lenin and Bukharin criticized her quite so much?
The main thing was that that she was just wrong in terms of her characterization of her discussion of Volume 2 of Capital, that her understanding about how capital accumulates is wrong. And from that point of view, also that the notion that capitalism is completely dependent on these huge areas of that's manifestly not happened, has it? You now have the whole world is capitalist effectively. You can't find very many places left at all. But what you don't see is anything like the end of capitalism. So there is an implication there that somehow capitalism will come to an end when the world becomes fully capitalist. But quite clearly that hasn't happened. And Bukharin and Lenin, I did have a reference. It was Bukharin talks about it in you can find it in the Marx, if you just Google the Marx Engels Internet Archive, and if you want to build up a bit, there's a nice little essay by Bukharin called Imperialism and the Accumulation of Capital, where he more fully criticizes Rosa Luxemburg's writings. My argument is that she may well have been wrong on a whole range of things, but nevertheless, as with any other great writer, there are insights there, even if there are also faults.
What about the question then of slavery? You touched on that in your opening, forced labor, etc. But slavery, is that part of, is it an integral part of imperialism arising, or do you see it as an integral part of capitalism, or is there where does it fall in?
Well, Marx actually talks about it in Capital as primitive accumulation, and this, of course, is taken up later by what's his name, the former Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Williams, Capitalism and Slavery. So we see, for example, even in the 16th century, with the development of the English slave trade, an opportunity really to build up a primitive accumulation of capital, which is then, of course, could be invested in largely in agricultural forms of capitalism. So it's, in a sense, it's proto-capitalism. On the one hand, slavery in a developed capitalist country, is completely anathema. After all, capitalism relies upon a legally free workforce with nothing else to sell but its labor power. Slavery, from that point of view, it is a vestige of that period of primitive accumulation, but nevertheless was tied up with that kind of early mercantile capital that we see in the earliest days, for example, of the British Empire. But of course, there are aspects of it that are even older than that. When Luxemburg is talking about international loans, she's talking in terms, for example, about Italian banks lending money for the development of British agricultural capitalism. So we're not seeing developed capitalism here, but an important part of accumulating a surplus that helps to, as it were, provide the basis for the early stages of capitalism.
Got one question on Bukharin. When you were talking about him, he dismisses the idea of state socialism, you mentioned, and quite rightly too. But then you said he was the one who developed the idea of socialism in one country, which clearly is a form of state socialism. Surely that's what it is. Is there a contradiction there, or how did he square that one?
I don't think he saw it in terms of state socialism, although of course that is what the Soviet Union became, the state administration of the entire economy. But he wasn't talking about state socialism in that context. And when he was talking about state socialism in imperialism and world economy, he was thinking in terms of the state directing economies, particularly during the First World War. There is a contradiction at the heart of Bukharin. I mean, the idea that you could have socialism in one country was, of course, unthinkable to any of the major thinkers in the development of Marxism. And it was, I think, really just a desperation to come up with something. And of course, what you end up with is a kind of state socialism. But that wasn't what Bukharin was referring to in his book.
All right, sorry. How then, quickly before we bring in Peter, then you mentioned before, the Soviet Union wasn't state capitalist. Briefly, just touching on that because that's an interesting subject that still comes up, doesn't it? And clearly, it wasn't state socialist in that sense either. How would you describe what the Soviet Union was?
It was a revolution that was defeated and therefore couldn't really go anywhere. I mean, without that revolution breaking out outside of Russia, it was destined to either revert to capitalism, which of course is ultimately what happened. And actually what happened is it became a kind of a frozen, stultified, neither one thing nor the other, a historical blind alley in a sense. So you didn't have the production of goods that were really commodities. There was no relationship between prices and values at all. So something that would normally be quite cheap in a world market would be incredibly expensive. Such as consumer goods of one sort or another. Other things would be cheap to the point of being almost free. So public transport or some books, but not all. And there was no relationship whatsoever. And workers didn't really sell their labor power in the same way. So it was one of those situations where it couldn't either go back to capitalism without what the events that we saw in 1989 onwards, and nor could it go forward to socialism without worldwide socialism.
Thank you, Ian. Peter, if you could switch your camera on.
Who knows more about this than me, by the way?
We'll find out. Hi, Peter.
Hi there, folks. Right, my picture's not coming up, so well, who cares? No, Ian knows a great deal as well. Yeah, I think I'm just wondering whether, Ian, whether you think the classical Marxist view has stood the test of time on imperialism. In relation to maybe Luxemburg and Lenin and Bukharin. So I know this talks about Bukharin and Luxemburg. There's a lot of similarities with Lenin and Bukharin, maybe bigger differences with Luxemburg. So which of either Luxemburg or the Bukharinist view has stood the test of the time today, to understand maybe the way imperialism has developed today? And another point I was thinking of is, and it's related to this, I suppose. It seems that Luxemburg did emphasise the underconsumption arguments, as you brought out, the overproduction of commodities in the heartlands of the imperialist powers, the national economies that they ruled. Seems to be the driving force for Luxemburg, for imperialism, to sell commodities then. Whereas for Lenin, it's about the expansion of capital, and for Bukharin, it's the expansion of capital. And I'm looking around the world today, and I'm seeing lots of underconsumption, and I'm seeing lots of areas of the world which you could classify really as non-capitalist if you related capitalism to the extraction of surplus value. The estrangement of labour power based on the extraction of surplus value, then, if you look at, I don't know, there's about 5 billion working age population in the globe. Only 1.5 billion of those would be classified as in employment, which, labour market kind of situation, i.e. directly related with capital. And so that suggests something about Luxemburg's underconsumptionist view to me, that the world is still very much like, as she described it herself, is that there's non-capitalist elements. I'm not saying they're untouched, like they live in a parallel world, and that because when you look at the 5 billion or so that are kind of working age population, we could say that they're in gradations of being commodified, but not fully, and some of them exist at the bottom end, as surplus labour, quite a lot of them. So the more we look at that, the more we look at a world that hasn't been colonised by capital. The labour power of that world hasn't been colonised by capital. But we do have imperialism, and we do have it based on capital expansion abroad. But we only have one imperialist power, and I'm just thinking how we got to that stage where there's no rivalry anymore that I can see except American hegemony, despite its problems. So, and I suppose you might come onto this like in other talks, I suppose, later down the line, if you're doing something on imperialism today, the later stages. So that's something that maybe not, Ian's not going to answer right now, but just that point on just your feelings on that, Ian, about the relevance of imperialism today from the point of view of the classical approach. And just one more thing, and I'll go then. It's just this issue, and you raised it, Ian, yourself, about, I don't know what you think about this, but I always think that a problem with all the classical traditional Lenin and Bukharin is that they don't really integrate the class struggle into an analysis of imperialism. They talk about capitalist struggle, capitalist competition, and in the drive as the driving force. Now Lenin, as you mentioned, this idea of the labour aristocracy. I think Bukharin touches on that in his imperialism and world economy, but only in passing again. And it seems to me that, like, soon after the World War ended, and even during the World War, we had a great deal of militancy, and we had a revolutionary situation post-war. So was this the war effort that suddenly revived the militancy of Labour, or was that militancy not really taken account of properly by Lenin in the beginning, and he kind of overemphasized this kind of thing about the kind of the conservative nature of some elements of the working class who made the deal with their own imperialist powers. So I was just wondering where that flip came, the militancy came, and whether that's something that would have been picked up earlier if a class struggle approach had been taken. I don't know whether that makes sense or not, but anyway, I enjoyed your talk, Ian, and it was good to get the clarification of Luxemburg and Bukharin. Cheers.
Thanks, Peter. Comrades, if anybody else got any questions or comments, please click raise hand and we can bring you in. Ian, want to reply to something?
I think the first thing to say is there's not nearly enough research by Marxists on the question of imperialism. One of the great things about Luxemburg was that she was prepared to sort of look at Marx, not as a sacred text, but to raise questions about his schema and whether that really applies and so on. And although I'm sure there are many of the criticisms leveled by Bukharin and Lenin against Luxemburg were correct, she does have some real insights in terms of the way, for example, the surplus is extracted. And we're not looking at a colonial world in quite the same way. And of course, what this tends to throw up is all sorts of non-Marxist versions of post-colonialism and talking in terms of globalization, categories which are designed to avoid any kind of discussion about the extraction of surplus from the working population, whether they are fully paid up proletarians, as we might see in large parts of India or Europe, or whether they are having a different form of extraction of surplus. And of course, you're right, there is only one world hegemon, there is only one significant imperialist power. But China too, of course, exports capital. China too is able to extract a surplus from large parts of the world. And of course, what we're currently seeing in the war that's being conducted against Russia and indeed in Palestine is that world hegemon trying to assert its authority through violence, which imperialist powers always have. But in the past, it was possible to extract that surplus in a way which had a measure of acquiescence on the part of the working population. There was an ideology that went with it. Bukharin makes a brief reference to ideology in his book, but of course, the ideology of imperialism is enormously important. I mean, in the context of the First World War, the fact that millions of men went off to fight and kill one another, who had more in common with one another than they did with their own ruling class, is itself a testimony to the fact that imperialism exerted a controlling influence in terms of ideology. Can we say that now? On the face of it, yes, there isn't much of an opposition to the war in Ukraine. There isn't much of an opposition to war in Palestine, genocide in Palestine, but there is an opposition, and it is growing. Whether it can lead to the overthrow of capitalism is another question. I think that there's not nearly enough work being done on any of it. I think that it would be important for Marxists really to kind of grasp what's new about the present. And I'm hoping we'll have speakers on. So Mike McNair, Michael Roberts, I'm hoping will be speaking. That maybe I'll try to answer some of these questions better than I. Yeah, just that really for now.
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, I was going to mention this, the no rival to the US. It's certainly true that China is. I think that is what is the Ukraine war is about, isn't it? It is if you don't look at it in a global context, it makes no sense at all why the US would keep pushing for the Ukraine to carry on to the last Ukrainian. There is something else going on, and Marxists always have to look at the bigger picture, not just, believe what the news are telling us. So this is not about Russia and Ukraine. This is about breaking Russia for sure, but the main aim is China, and to make sure to show China for a start. This is what we're going to do with you if you start rising up and also try to have imperialist designs on the rest of the world. This is another interesting question. We're going to hopefully talk to Michael Roberts about it. Do you think China as it is, and according to the definitions we've learned with you then today, is that an imperialist country? Is Russia an imperialist country at the moment?
I would argue that China is an imperialist country, but it's very much a minor one relative to the United States. It has, I think, the potential to be a much bigger imperialist country. And of course, the leadership of the United States knows that. And it's why they're prepared to encircle it, and if necessary, cause the deaths of millions to make sure it doesn't happen. I think, I'm not sure that one could talk about Russia as an imperialist country. Both Bukharin and Lenin, and I think to a certain extent Luxemburg, are clear that the mere acquisition of land or the mere military seizure of some part of territory is not of itself imperialism. It might be brutal, it might be nasty, it might have all sorts of aims involved in it, but it isn't of itself imperialism in the sense that they mean it. So Russia's invasion of Ukraine is an attempt to prevent that encirclement, an attempt to prevent the loss of a sphere of influence, which it had previously had as part of, first of all, the Russian Empire, but then, of course, later the Soviet Union. Putin is on record as saying that he regarded the collapse of the Soviet Union as one of the most catastrophic events of the 20th century, which, in the scheme of all the other events of the 20th century, is quite an extraordinary statement. But that idea that the former Soviet Union should have a sphere of influence. Of course, spheres of influence are a feature of the kind of 19th century, 20th century imperialist world too. The other aspect of it all, of course, is the demise of the Soviet Union and the part that has played. There isn't any kind of countervailing force. You won't find me defending the Soviet Union under any circumstances, but the fact that there was a countervailing force helped to prevent some of the worst excesses of US imperialism before. And also the fact that the Soviet Union existed, that concessions had to be made, and concessions are now not being made. Concessions both in terms of adventurist, militarist exploitation and attacks on large parts of the world, turning previously relatively affluent and well-developed parts of the world into turning them back, 50, 70 years in terms of their development. If one thinks of Syria or Libya or a whole range of other countries. And this has been exactly what the United States has attempted to do. It would rather see a part of the world turned into a failed state than potentially offer any kind of resistance to it whatsoever. And the only people who pay for it, of course, are the working class.
It's of course going on in the Middle East at the moment as well. I think that's Israel's, as a satellite kind of state of satellite imperial state of the US is trying to do to its neighboring countries as well, is basically putting them, out of action, make them so unstable that they kind of loom large, Israel, in and destroy any kind of potential rebellion, etc. A last question, if there's no comments from the floor anymore. Talking about the sort of the class struggle in those colonial countries, which is an interesting question, which you kind of touched upon. There is a sort of tradition on the left as well. You always have to support, of course, colonial struggles, etc. But they have limitations, aren't they? And that's why Marx and Engels looked at developed countries, saying that socialism, as opposed to a defensive war, for liberation, etc., is one thing, but the struggle for socialism has to happen in the developed countries. Could you explain that a bit more? Why they made such an emphasis on the development aspect there, and that they didn't think that the Congo or something fighting again for liberation could become socialist anytime soon?
In large part, it's abundance. A prerequisite for socialism is abundance. If you one of the great difficulties of having ostensibly a peasant economy or an agricultural economy, whether it's peasant or whether it's a kind of agri-capitalism, usually doesn't have the kind of abundance that's capable of bringing anything resembling socialism into being. So it's crucial that they are developed countries. But what counts as developed? Well, look at India. You have a country which has huge disparities from subsistence farmers through to engineers engaged in its space project. The other thing, of course, is that I didn't bring it I didn't want to muddy the waters really, but of course, Luxemburg had quite a different attitude towards Lenin on the right of nations to self-determination. And I don't think it was because she was necessarily wrong about that. But I appreciate this. Not everyone will agree with me on that one. Rosa Luxemburg famously didn't necessarily support the idea of Polish independence, because she ultimately was arguing that what we're in favour of is a socialist world. There's more to it than that, but nevertheless, I think it's an important point. And I think the other thing is she was critical of Lenin and the right of nations to self-determination, because she regarded that as a kind of abstract right, as it were, which is just as comfortable with bourgeois theoreticians as it is with Marxist ones. And ultimately, we're in favour of the end of the nation state. The other thing about imperialism and what we might call third worldism, as it were, sometimes we have to look outside of the kind of immediate circle of great classical Marxist writers. I mean, Frantz Fanon's writing the Wretched of the Earth, which of course is a line from the Internationale, Debout des dames de la terre, arise, the wretched of the earth, arise ye starvelings from your slumber. But Frantz Fanon, of course, took that. He was a psychiatrist and took an interest in how people internalized their own oppression, and in the context of colonialism. He was from Martinique and grew up in the shadow of French imperialism, and of course ultimately sided with the Algerian war for independence. Hundreds of thousands, I think in excess of 100, I can't remember the exact, but it was a huge number of people died in Algeria gaining its independence. And there's a question about whether yes, we support the poor and oppressed, but when you end up supporting a nationalist movement without that idea of it's about the international proletariat taking power worldwide, if you lose that perspective, you end up supporting nationalist movements, which end up being ultimately very destructive. And usually the first thing those nationalists do when they get into power is kill the left, the very left that supported them.
The opposition, yeah. You mentioned the abundance question, but surely it also has to do with the strength of the working class, that you actually have a majority working class in that country and not small peasantry or something like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's not to dismiss the very real suffering that peasants go through, but it's to say, well, to what extent can the peasantry form that revolutionary class that can transform the world? The usual Marxist argument is that it can't. And what you saw in the Soviet Union was the idea of an alliance between the peasantry and the proletariat was actually a unique formation. I mean, no one would have thought of that. This was something, this a very particular contribution made by Lenin. That, if you want to overthrow the autocracy, you need an alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry in the context where the peasantry was the overwhelming majority of the population. Does that apply to Germany today? The German peasantry's been wiped out. The French peasantry's hanging on by its fingernails, and it's hardly, I don't know how significant it is, but it's nothing compared to what it was. And elsewhere in the world, where do you see such a huge peasantry outside of largely underdeveloped countries?
And peasants aren't reactionary because they're peasants, are they? They're reactionary because they own their own means of production, aren't they? They are their own little capitalists, really, and so they have a lot to lose in the drive towards socialism, whereas the working class has nothing to lose. It's chains. Yeah. Paul.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks, Ian. That was great talk. I've got a question about the relationship between Lenin and Bukharin and Luxemburg. It's around whether Luxemburg and Bukharin have a notion of the labor aristocracy and the way in which imperialism acts to control the working class in the dominant nations of the world. That's my question, because it seems to me that that's an important concept, the labor aristocracy, of a section of the working class in the imperialist countries which are bought off, which is Lenin's idea, it seems to me. But I'd always assumed that there would be reference in his pamphlet to the super exploitation of workers, and I haven't come across it yet. I haven't finished the pamphlet, but we're studying it in a group at the moment. And anyway, that's my question, and there's a few thoughts around whether you can bring together the export of capital, the super exploitation of workers, the decline of capitalism through imperialism, and the rise of nationalism as well, which you've touched on, and how the aristocracy of labor contributes to certainly the nationalism of the oppressor states. Thank you.
It's nice to see you again, Paul.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think there's a real sharp difference between Bukharin and Lenin, if there is one. Bukharin seems to be fully aware that in a sense, it's the whole of the proletariat of the imperialist countries that's bought off, and not just the labor aristocracy, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
However, you don't tend to see it in Luxembourg in the same way. I don't recall when I was reading through. I mean, I concentrated on part 3 because of the importance of imperialism. But you don't really see the idea there of a working class being bought off. The other aspect of it, and I think this is important, is that you don't necessarily, because you have a relatively privileged proletariat in the developed capitalist countries does not of itself mean that they are an undifferentiated reactionary mass. In fact, ironically, it's often the reserve army of labour which has been most radical. I mean, historically, it's been people like print compositors because they could read, or relatively well-off workers because they could afford to go on strike, because they did have the education and other resources to fight back. So although I think that nationalism, although I think that the imperialism today, I mean, we see with the sort of riffraff that hangs around Tommy Robinson and whatever, we can say, well, look, here's a classic example of a working class which has been bought off, but actually it's a working class that's lost its place. It hasn't been bought off. It's lost its place relative to other sections of the British proletariat. It's lost its place in the world too. And we see it in the United States, and that seems to form the basis of people like Trump or Nigel Farage or whatever else. But that, again, it doesn't mean to say they're irredeemably bourgeois or irredeemably reactionary. I think under conditions where the only way of saying fuck off to your own ruling class is to vote for these people, I think there's some of that going on, and I don't think it necessarily means workers who today might vote for the Reform Party for whatever weird reason would necessarily turn into some sort of new fascist bloc or always be right wing. So I think imperialism still exerts an influence on large sections of the British working class, and we see that, for example, in whilst there is, I'm pretty sure there'll be 100,000 people, if not more, out on the streets for Palestine solidarity on Saturday. Join us there. Tina and I will be there. So we do see large sections of the British working class standing in solidarity with the people of Palestine. We also see vast numbers that don't, and imperialism, I think, it does exert an influence still. But I think that quite often those sections of the working class who have lost their place in the world are turning to the right in the absence of anything from the left. And I don't think it's necessarily inevitable that you'll see populist movements continually resurgent, although I may just be sort of guilty of compulsory optimism or something.
That's no bad thing to have. This is interesting, the question of the working class being bought off, isn't it? Because the working class doesn't often feel bought off because we're still getting paid crumbs, etc. But also internally, there's a difference now, isn't it? When you have, for example, when we had the Soviet Union as a sort of rival power bloc, you actually get internally in Britain, and in Germany, etc., you had the working class being bought off to hold off the red thread, and Keynesianism, etc., wasn't sort of a Labourite. That's what Labour brought us, and it's not something I would argue that can be brought back by somebody like Jeremy Corbyn, who's had that as his program. That we just have to push like we did in 45, and you push along, and then you're getting we're getting some basically crumbs again from a Keynesianist type of program, but that seems very unlikely, and everything we've seen from this Labour Party government for sure seems that the opposite is happening. It is asserting the fact that there's only one sort of imperialist country left that hasn't got any real rivalry, and Keynesianism is not something that can be revived, which means you actually have to fight for more, which is why we're Marxists. How do you see that kind of buying off, within the imperialist countries as well in as in a more international sense.
Yeah, we're back to naked class struggle. There's not going to be some sort of third way, whatever that is. And the likelihood is, especially given given we're going to be seeing continuous war for the foreseeable future. Again, it does come down to this question of guns or butter. You know, we're going to be workers are going to have to take constant pay cuts to pay for a war effort. Despite all this nonsense about stopping the boats and all the rest of it, we know that the ruling class is perfectly happy to see the free movement of labour, perfectly happy to exploit people who will work for less than the minimum wage. That they use this cant about stopping small boats is purely an electoral ruse. But of course, that can't last forever. We're already seeing situations where the ruling class feels the need to force down wage rates just in order to pay for wars and ever increasing exploitation of the working class. And I don't think that's going to be lost on everybody forever. At the moment, it has succeeded in dividing some workers, but I don't think it will last forever. You know, we are back to sort of naked class struggle. There's not going to be some sort of Keynesian series of concessions that are going to be made to buy workers off somehow. I can't imagine under what circumstances that would happen.
Yes, indeed, especially if we just call for Keynesian demands, you know, then you're definitely not going to get them. If you prepare for a revolution, then the ruling class might feel forced to give us crumbs, etc. But you're never going to get what you fight for. You always have to fight for much, much more to get even a few crumbs. Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you for your contributions, comrades. A very good introduction, couple of introductory sessions. We are revisiting this subject every 2 weeks. For example, we're going to have Matthew Jones discussing the state of US imperialism and the threats from China. But we're also going to try to get Michael Roberts to talk about China precisely and particularly. And also Mike McNair, as Ian has outlined. If anybody has any other suggestions that we should look at in this mini-series, or indeed the Communist Culture Club, please get in touch. Next week, we are taking another look at Shakespeare. Luke Prodomu is coming back. He's going to look at Marx and money. This time, social conflict, gold, money, commodity, etc. It's going to be a real good session. We've already recorded parts of it, so I'm looking forward to it. See you next week, comrades. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.